Chapter 2. New Adventures, New Danger. The IAC cruiser Winton was just visible in the twilight sky above the planet Perfecton, a small and swiftly circling star. Outside her tent on the planet's surface, Bernice put a hand to her brow and watched the ship twinkle as it passed through the smoke of the campfire. It had done that for 2 weeks now, completing an orbit every 2 hours, a little clock for this timeless old world. The Winton was the most powerful craft available to St. Oscar's University, an ex-military vessel capable of carrying a crew of 100. Much of this capacity, including the weapons bay that once held missiles, had been filled with scientific equipment and provisions for the expedition. The journey had taken a week through hyperspace. The official quarantine of the planet, enforced by a number of blockade satellites, had expired a day before the ship arrived. The satellites had exploded on the deadline as promised, leaving a trail of debris around the planet. Bits of that fell into the atmosphere at regular intervals, creating spectacular meteor showers. As far as the ship's crew had established, there was nobody else in orbit around Perfecton. St. Oscar's was the only academic body with a permit to land, as yet, but the reputation of the planet stretched across the civilized galaxy. Unlicensed explorers could be relied upon to arrive at some point. Upon achieving orbit, one of the Winton's jolly boats had immediately descended to the surface, the university's small team of security troops making the first landing to check for weapon systems, atmospheric poisons, and other environmental problems, such as the viral contamination that had worried Philippe. Their survey took a day, and during that time, Bernice had found herself pacing the ship as if she was waiting for her date to show up, stopping at a window from time to gaze down at the silvery grey globe below. Wolsey, whom, seeing as everybody else had treated this trip as a beano she had brought along in a basket, got a lot of petting that day. But even during the waiting, much to her guilt, Bernice had never got round to reading Professor Archduke's theatrical thesis. In a moment of mental strength, she had loaded it into the ship's central computer for replay on her lectern. But something else had come up before she could actually read the first line. The academics who wangled a trip on this historic mission included Professor Warrender, who had spent most of the journey out looking extremely worried. Bernice had asked him what was wrong, but he had just waggled his paws and replied that he was getting precognitive flashes whose contents he could not take seriously. He would not elaborate further. Menlove Stokes had, thankfully, left his tubes at home, though he had in his luggage several suspicious-looking sample jars. He announced at one of the many shipboard parties that he was going to develop a new style of painting, one suited to the colours and textures of Perfecton's surface. Hetty and Lucinda had managed to secure the ship's captain for both their parties, but only because he had dashed from one end of the ship to the other when Hetty was looking the other way. And Bernice had been delighted to make the acquaintance of Professor Arthur Candy, a chubby and jolly academic whose subject of study she hadn't managed to discover. This group, and the other 50 academics who'd managed to blag a passage on this trip, had descended in the third boat. The second boat, at Bernice's request, was reserved for herself and her tutorial group, who would, after all, be doing all the hard work in the next 3 weeks. She stepped out onto the surface of this new old world and lifted her foot to inspect the imprint that her boot had made in the silver dust. "That's one small step for a single woman," she whispered. And, looking up into the face of a spectacular Perfecton sunset, she had stretched to her greatest height, fallen back against the chattering gang of her students, and whooped to the sky. That had got an interesting, if rather scared look from Doran. The reality had been as good as the anticipation. The surface of the planet was covered in a soft grey dust. It formed dunes that stretched to every horizon, that shifted and whispered under the gentle winds of a thoroughly breathable and, indeed, invigorating atmosphere. It was the opposite of rain, and, for that reason alone, the Della delegation were glad to be in it. Bernice's team had established a camp in the lee of one of Perfecton's major cities. A group of 7 tall, lozenge-shaped buildings that, eroded as they were, still managed to tower over the sand. They were golden in colour, and, silhouetted against the vast red bulk of the setting sun, they were a sight that, after 2 weeks, still made Bernice ache. It was an ache to stay. Their mission was just to map the ground, establish parameters, take some minor samples. And an ache for something long lost and now returned, something that she didn't dare identify. This was where she belonged, in the field. Because here you could work so hard you didn't get time to think about your mistakes. Now Bernice stretched again, luxuriating in the alien landscape. Picking up her rucksack, she headed towards the campfire. Whereas, in the drunken rush to complete her ordinary packing, Bernice had forgotten her toothbrush, her earrings, and several sets of underwear, she'd got her rucksack, as she always did, absolutely right. It contained her archaeological equipment, her data retrieval systems, and a number of carefully selected tools and ration packs, as well as the standard bottle of fine brandy. This rucksack had saved Bernice's life many times. She could pack it blindfold, and once, owing to a mistake involving a pair of handcuffs and an alarm clock, she had. The golden towers to the west had, by now, been thoroughly mapped by the tutorial group, and the beacons they'd left as markers across the site could be seen all the way to the base of those monuments, winking in the declining light. The students had returned to the camp, and had collapsed around the campfire, groaning and laughing. Those were good sounds. Bernice had spent the day recording the inscriptions on a big pair of golden doors that, presumably, led into the city that she was sure lay buried under the towers. So far, her translators could make nothing of the language. She reached in her rucksack and found what she was looking for. An elderly, blue-bound notebook, a little frayed at the spine, its pages filled with yellow notelets. This was the latest incarnation of Bernice's diary, and the sticky-tabbed notelets were what she used to rewrite particularly dull or angst-ridden episodes into more glittering things. She opened it and, sitting cross-legged beside her students, pushed her glasses up on her nose and poised her pen to write. "It is the last day of our initial mapping mission," she told the group. "We return to the ship at midnight for the best night's sleep any of us have had in the last 2 weeks. Anybody got any observations for posterity?" "Never worked so hard in my life," laughed Philippe. "My boots are full of dust." "Very, very messy," agreed Waspo, who was using a spray to try to return the shine to her flat but fashionable shoes. "But I'm looking forward to writing it all up. There's a book in this, wouldn't you say?" Bernice met her inquiring gaze evenly. "I'll have to see if my publisher's interested, but I'm a bit busy at the moment." Waspo looked shocked. "I didn't mean—" Bernice waved the response aside and pointed to the girl's shoes. "Do the undersides as well, but not the heels if you're walking over sand." Plus had stood up and was gazing at the horizon, a hand to his brow. "At the end of the day, though," he said, "one has to say that the performance has been nothing short of brilliant." "He means, like the sunset looks good," noted Arex. "It's been a good few days, you know. I've had a good time." "We've all had a good time," Marjorie murmured, taking the hands of her neighbours to the left and right. "And I feel much closer to everybody here because of this bonding experience. I think it would be nice if we could all sing something to celebrate our mutual closeness." "Oh, can we sing?" Rose turned eagerly to Bernice, smoothing back the colourful braids in her hair. "Can we, Professor Summerfield?" Doran glanced laconically up from where he was tossing sticks into the fire. "Yes, Bernice. Know any good songs?" "Can we call her Bernice?" Rose looked between Bernice and Doran. "Is that allowed?" "Virtually everything is allowed," Bernice replied, glancing at Doran over her glasses again. "Call me whatever you're comfortable with, as long as it's flattering." "Then I shall call you Benny," Rose cut in quickly. "And I bet you know some good songs from all that time you spent exploring space." "I heard she was in the military," Arex added, with a wry glance at Benny, oppressing my people and anybody else who stood in Earth's way. Bernice closed her eyes for a moment. This must be what being a mother was like. At least Arex was now baiting her with a touch of self-mockery. I was conscripted, straight out of the academy, yes, like a lot of us were during the wars. I bailed out of a troopship on the way to a battle, joined a dig by faking my qualifications, and worked my way up to being in charge of many expeditions. I gained my doctorate on the run through experience. Any more questions? Gosh, said Rose. Now, as to the matter of music, Bernice took off her glasses and dropped them into her top pocket. I know several campfire ditties, but few as appropriate as this one. Some of the words may be strange to you. They come from Old English, from an era that I specialise in. She took a deep breath and began to sing. It was on the good ship Venus. On the other side of the dunes, further from the towers of the Perfecton city, Menlove Stokes looked up from his painting and frowned. Is that some sort of desert creature howling? Not unless it knows some very rude words, chuckled Professor Candy as he wandered by, clutching a glass of champagne. He stopped for a moment to take a look at Stokes' canvas, winced, and moved on. The academic staff had set up camp a mile or so from the archaeological site, and had spent the last 2 weeks trying to justify their presence. Stokes had his painting, of course. Candy had been sunbathing in a pair of outsized shorts, and Hetty and Lucinda had spent the time arguing over the best word to describe the beautiful desolation that surrounded them. They'd got to the point of agreeing that it should be a new word, a word never heard before. Hetty had settled on lituminous, Lucinda on sithering, and from that point both ladies had become entrenched in their points of view. They were now settled in sofas at opposite ends of a wilderness barbecue and wine tasting, a crowd of other academics milling around them. Professor Epstein, who was a specialist in Chelonian literature, with a neat little beard and a pair of tape-repaired glasses permanently attached to his nose, was waving a vegetarian sausage meanfully and explaining the nature of his work to Professor Owl, an elderly, rather buxom cosmologist who used a monocle and was never without her grey cardigan. They don't have a word for comedy. That's the whole shtick with these martial races. They have to take themselves so seriously because if they don't, their society collapses. They're an almost adolescent race, and once you know adolescence, they think the only art form that's valid is melodrama, a bunch of serious individuals yelling at each other about serious subjects. And those subjects invariably require those characters to use and carry weapons. The mark of a sane society, Professor, or any sane person, is comedy, the ability to laugh at oneself. You introduce a hint of comedy into a culture like the Chelonian, and... He made a vast, deflating gesture. The whole thing falls apart. Ooh, that's exactly what my academic speciality is about, he began, and started enthusing to them. Professor Warrender was scampering from one end of the party to the other, trying to please both Hetty and Lucinda with his choice of wines. He arrived at a hop to fill Stokes's outstretched glass, and gazed at the artist's canvas in wonder. Why, it's lovely, he chittered. Stokes stopped painting and blinked at him, astonished. This wasn't the normal reaction to his work. Do you really think so? Yes, it reminds me of a dream I once had. A surreal thing, full of fear and vertigo. It's a self-portrait, said Stokes. I'm sure it could be that too. Are you still getting those headaches? Stokes asked, a little too sharply. Indeed. The Packard settled for a moment and tapped his skull with his paw. My precognitive abilities keep on telling me that something strange and wonderful is about to happen, but when I try to ascertain just what that is, the images I get are bizarre. Stokes shrugged. He wasn't really used to the company of academics, not having been one for very long. It was difficult to tell the reality from the pose sometimes. More than anything else, Stokes detested pretentious people. Perhaps you're just visualizing my next work. is going to be a painting that will encompass the entire visual experience of this planet. I'm going to paint it tonight, on a precipice I've found that lies above a magnificent valley, the scene illuminated only by the light of the luminescent rocks in that area. Warrender sniffed. Your canvas, does it smell peculiar to you? Not at all, Stokes smiled. It smells, Professor Warrender, of humanity. All else to do. Bernice's party finished the song. During the laughter and cheering, Doran made his way around the fire to where Bernice was sitting and put his hand on her shoulder. Excuse me, could I have a word, in private? Benny felt two terrible urges at the same time. One to scream no, he couldn't. The other to throw him into a fireman's lift and run off across the dunes with him. Of course, is what she settled on, not without a little lump in her throat. The rest of you start packing up the tents. The boat will be here in 20 minutes. They walked across the dunes in the vague direction of Hetty and Lucinda's barbecue. The trail of smoke from that was the only cloud in the neon black of the Perfecton night. There was silence, apart from the swish of their feet in the sand and the distant conversation of both camps. Bernice knitted her fingers behind her back, attempting to look old and wise. She and Doran had been smiling at each other over tools and brushing past each other in narrow rock corridors these last 2 weeks. He'd stopped being shy and had achieved a sort of gentle confidence around her, which was just the worst sort of thing for Bernice's composure. She no longer felt like the aggressor in their little held-too-long glances. Something was going to happen here at some point, if she let it. It's about the star, Doran began. Uh-huh. I did a course in astrophysics at my last college. Just the basics, but enough to know that this star is a very old, very diffuse red giant. Surely it could go supernova at any time. Bernice nodded. Of course. But the ship's sensors would detect the first signs of such a collapse. I've been assured there's a plan to get us away in time. She took his arm in a matronly, mentor-like way, and was pleased that the action made him straighten up slightly, nervous. But that isn't the most scary bit, Michael. That was the first time she'd used his first name. The climate here is impossible for a planet orbiting a red giant. So, presumably, it's maintained by some remaining piece of Perfecton technology, one which could go wrong at any moment, leaving us all suddenly vulnerable to the chill vacuum of space. She watched Doran absorb that information. He stopped walking. All of a sudden, he said, I feel really cold. Do you? Bernice let go of his arm. They looked at each other for a moment. He was terrifyingly young, and he was looking at her evenly now, without nerves. There was a moment in which they just got to know the details of each other's face. She made a sudden little noise of closure and slapped him heartily on the shoulder. Let's get back to the camp. Yes, let's. He seemed almost as relieved as she was. When they got back to the camp, Bernice was pleased to find that Professor Candy had arrived carrying his luggage, and that she now had somebody she could naturally talk to without having to look at Doran. The camp was packed up, the tents rolled, and the campfire switched off. Waspo was supervising everybody, pointing to canteens and tools that had escaped the packing, and Arex had already reached his most fearsome level of glower. Bernice, called Professor Candy, waving his chubby hand. Oh, we know where you've been. What? Benny flushed. What do you mean? I've merely been discussing some important issues with... She stopped and forced her face into a chilly smile. Ah, yes, that's me. I never miss a chance to seduce my students. Ha ha ha! Is the boat here yet? As if on cue, a moving star grew brighter overhead, and gravitic engines started to wash the dunes flat. Benny couldn't quite meet Candy's happy glance as the boat descended. Menlove Stokes wistfully watched the boat ascend from the archaeologists' camp. Warrender, Hetty and Lucinda and the other academics had retired to their tents. Candy had got out while the going was good, electing to sleep back on the Winton. The night was Stokes's, and the chill of the increasing darkness brought with it a sense of expectation. There was, he felt sure, a key to this planet, a dark heart that could be divined only through the artistic impulse. Perhaps tonight he would glimpse it, absorb it, transfer it to his canvas. He picked up his artist's materials and his jars, and, with a single Gothic glance over his shoulder, raced off into the night. The valley of his dreams awaited him. The boat having docked with the Winton, Bernice found that she was very tired. She had been operating on adrenaline for the last 2 weeks, and the thought of curling up in a real bunk appealed to her more than anything. She was, for one thing, mentally kicking herself for being so teenagerish over Doran. Like a snake or a spider, he was almost certainly more afraid of her than she was of him. Before she'd got married, she hadn't been this much of a wimp. She resolved either to go for it, take him out to dinner, impress him with her wit and depth, shag him like a bunny, or drop it, treat him like any other student, and stop being so soppy. Which of these two options to pursue was an entirely different question. While pondering this, she popped her head into the tiny flight deck of the ship and knocked on a bulkhead. "Hello?" Captain Bolson glanced up from the desk, where he was leafing idly through instrument logs. He was a handsome, athletic, middle-aged man, with a black beard and a receding hairline. At the controls behind him sat a very beautiful young woman with long auburn hair. Both of them wore the uniforms of IAC non-academic staff. "Good evening, Professor. What can we do for you?" "Just a small worry before bedtime. One of my students thinks that the star's going to blow up and kill us all." "Oh, it's entirely possible." The captain settled into his chair. "The blowing up bit, anyway. That star could detonate right now or in 300 years' time. It's impossible to tell." He nodded over his shoulder. "Aurum here is my navigator. You've been briefed on this, haven't you, Lieutenant Salvistra?" The young woman glanced up at Bernice. "The captain's right about the star. I believe that it was one of the factors that Earth Central took into account when opening the quarantine on Perfecton." "You're very well informed, but if it does go boom, we're completely prepared. The automatics are tuned to listen for the first signs of collapse, and they'll have the whole ship up and about if it starts to happen. We'll have about 3 hours then before supernova, more than enough time to evacuate everyone and get into hyperspace." The captain stroked his beard thoughtfully. "You know, I have been wondering if anybody told your fellow academics about this." "That sounds like the Dean's sense of humour," Bernice grinned, and bade the captain good night. Stokes stood on a ledge above the great valley. The whole sweep of the planet, from horizon to horizon, was darkened now, the only source of light being the patches of phosphorescent minerals that lined the valley walls. The bottom lay over 2 miles below him, obscured slightly by gleaming mists that reflected the light from the walls. There was something strange about the shape of the valley floor, thought Stokes. He had expected it to look different at night. He had chanced to cross this valley in broad daylight, but there was definitely an unusual shape down there. His artist's eye would pick it out when he started painting, he was certain. He set up his easel and started to wash the canvas with a silver base. The strangest thing about this planet was the silence. No bird or animal noises, no leaves rustling. The only sound was the continual wash of wind on sand. What with the ozone in the air, it was rather like being at the seaside. He glanced up at the thin column of smoke that drifted from behind the low hills nearby. They'd put out the barbecue. Good. Human activity seemed wrong here, like bunting at a funeral procession. It was as if they had brought time to a timeless world, started a clock ticking where previously there had only been forever. He picked up his palette knife and made the first slash of paint across the canvas, red on silver. He hadn't got to the bodily fluids yet, but he still shivered slightly at the sight of it. From the informative record of recent Grell history. Note by Professor B.S. Summerfield, translator. While the Grell pride themselves on their information gathering and classification, Grell literature, perversely, tends to emphasize the emotional aspects of their story. It's as if the Grell mind can only experience the sensations and excitements of conflict in later contemplation. Their scribes, working from exact and precise data recordings transmitted to Grellor on a moment-by-moment basis by teams in the field, feel free to embellish this data with the most heroic details. Presumably, any Grell who wishes to peruse the actual records can access the originals. We would accurately describe the process of writing Grell history as novelization. Millions of heights above the head of the unknowing humans on the planet, the golden shape of the Wintons swung around the world in its clock-like orbit. And hundreds of heights above that, unseen by any of the unsuspecting lesser beings, sat another, smaller craft. Its shape was that of a five-pointed star with many sensor probes extending from its hull. It was a data runner of the glorious Grell. From inside the craft, two handsomely tentacled faces gazed down at the image of the Winton on a viewing screen, and laughed in a proud and confident laugh. "Confirmed, Master. That is an Inman-class cruiser, withdrawn from military service because of problems with its sensors. Main problem, the inability to sense objects above itself." "Good fact, servitor." The master of the Grell data force leant back from the screen, the tentacles of its face twiddling themselves into keen knots of anticipation. Above the tentacles sat two particularly gleaming and flat black eyes, and they were filled with excitement also. Note: the Grell have humanoid bodies with thin, tentacular fingers. Their bulbous heads and similarly tentacular faces sit atop thin, muscular torsos. They are so much a human nightmare that it has been speculated that they were created specially by a particularly bloody-minded genetic engineer. Their own creation legends talk of stumbling up from the ocean and being clever enough to make themselves bodies that could walk. That cleverness bit is the central plank of the Grellan psyche as expressed in the informative record. The Grell are cleverer than anybody else, they know more things, and they like to laugh at the dolts that trouble the planets of other star systems. They think of themselves as the monarchs of information, uncaring that everybody else thinks of them as rather gittish pirates. "So, they are not aware of us." The Grell master turned to his servitors and clenched his powerful fist. "Prepare the attack force." Extract ends. Bernice had fallen asleep in the bath, a victim of the lag that, even when the ship's hours have been synchronized with that of the target area on the destination planet, catches up with you in spaceflight. She was woken up by the noise of Woolsey scratching against the door. She splashed out, staring at her water-wrinkled fingers in shock, threw on her robe, and opened the door for him. She was surprised to see Doran there as well, in the corridor that ran between the bathroom and the passenger bunk rooms. He was leaning on the bulkhead, dressed in a bathrobe of his own, sound asleep, the towel he was carrying having fallen at his feet. Bernice picked up Woolsey and breezily tapped Doran on the shoulder. "Bathroom's free?" He jumped and woke up. "Oh, right. Thanks. Why ever didn't you knock on the door?" "I knew it was you in there from the singing. I thought you deserved a bit of a soak, with all the work you've put in, so I left you for a while." "Listening to me sing?" "Lullaby of Birdland, isn't that what it's called? It certainly was a lullaby in my case." Bernice realized that she was feeling a great deal more stable, having napped and soaked. Her hormones were, at this moment, blissfully under control again. So she made that big decision she'd been sleeping on. She picked up Doran's towel and handed it to him. "In you go," she said. "When you've finished, you can pop in and have a glass of brandy with me, if you want." "That would be nice." There was a little moment of stillness again, but this time it was just good. Then he went into the bathroom, and Bernice headed for her room. "Yip," she whispered to Woolsey. Stokes had slapped the vague shape of the valley onto his canvas. Now, before adding colour and texture, he took a step back from his work and looked down into the chasm again. Once more, something had changed. "Oh dear," he muttered. "I hope this doesn't turn out to be one of those planets that are actually gigantic living organisms." He looked quickly between his painting and the valley floor many times until he worked out what had changed. Under a particularly dense patch of mist, a new rock outcrop had appeared. At least, that's what he thought it was. He couldn't make out any detail on the shadowy form. It was thin and tall and, Stokes made a little noise at the realization, it was moving, as if it was alive. The thing was slowly but surely turning, like a plant in a time-lapse film following the course of the sun. He glanced upwards and saw the star that was the Winton sailing smoothly in its orbit overhead. He looked between the outcrop and the ship and raised a very worried finger. Bernice dried her hair and dabbed her wrists, neck and, what the hell, cleavage with, a perfume for an alien or a human. She arranged her robe carefully to show an accidentally large but still academically decent area of herself. She unhitched the catch from the door so it just hung shut by its own weight. She went to the brandy on the pull-out table by the bed and had a small glass, quickly appalled by what she was contemplating here. She had worked hard. She deserved this. It had been a very long time. She had love to give, and had been unfairly boxed up by her ex, shut away with their other shared possessions. He had probably been unfaithful already. Unfaithful. As if there was still any faith between them. Still, she felt guilty, felt that he was going to burst in at any moment. But no. This was hers now. She was free. She was going to sing this boy a lullaby. She just hoped that she could stay awake until he had finished his bath. Archduke's thesis. Right. That would focus her attention. Bernice went to the lectern on her tiny desk and brought up the menu from the ship's central computer. There was the manuscript, along with all the other academic source texts. She put her finger on the button to access it, and paused while she gave a great yawn. That was going to put her to sleep, not keep her awake. The central computer's access sprite popped up on the screen after a few moments, and with a flutter of graphic wings and a wave of its virtual wand, asked her petulantly if she was actually going to look at the text this time. If not, it would refile it in 20 minutes. She turned away from the lectern again and looked around the room nervously. Where should she be when he came in? What should she be doing? Not looking at a textbook. That would set up completely the wrong impression. That would be her being old again. Old and unwantable. And just something a student flirted with because he could, and he probably laughed with the others about it, and she went to lock her door. No, you must let yourself have this. She sat down on the edge of the bed, forcefully, and wondered about how she had gone from being a mature professor to an adult seductress to a teenager in the last 10 minutes, without at any time noticing these vast shifts in age. Bernice sighed, laughed a little, felt like crying, and arranged herself on the corner of the bed. From the informative record of recent Grell history. The excitingly coloured Grell ship descended towards the Winton, faster and faster, its spines extending and flexing, ready to clip into the other ship's data ports. At its airlocks, a squad of brave Grell servitors stood ready, spinning their two-headed data axes and flicking the security catches off the energy weapons contained therein. They started up an ululating cry as they spun their weapons faster and faster, the harmonics of the chant vibrating the hull that held them until every Grell could feel the purpose of its species in its throat. Their prey grew bigger beneath them, a ship full of knowledge, an appetizer for the planet below. Extract ends. Stokes heard something. It was coming from the valley below, And it was definitely there, not just one of those dream sounds that his ears kept inventing in the silence. He looked up from his half-completed canvas and stepped as near as he dared to the edge of the cliff. He'd watched the thing on the valley floor track the arc of the Winton for a full turn across the sky, after which it had stopped moving. He thought it had fallen back to lie pointing to the opposite direction, as if waiting for the ship to rise again. The whole business was a major discovery, of course, something to tell the archaeologists on board ship tomorrow. It was probably some sort of robotic antenna. Perhaps it was even now sending signals to the ship. For a while, Stokes had been torn between running back to the academics' camp and finishing his painting. In the end, when the thing had stopped moving, he decided that he'd missed the moment for sudden action and that art was, for now, more important. If he stopped painting, then he'd lose this quality of light, not to mention the quality of his own emotions, and when he returned to the canvas, nothing would be the same. Besides, if he didn't get a covering of plasty on this thing within a couple of hours, no gallery would be willing to subject his visitors to the smell of it. But the sound had stopped him again. He glanced at his watch and did a quick mental calculation. The Winton would appear over the horizon in about 10 minutes. He got to his knees and stared down into the valley, trying to make out what was going on beneath an ever more obscuring layer of mist. The noise was definitely coming from down there. It was a high screeching, gradually increasing in pitch, mechanical rather than biological. It reminded Stokes of... Now, what did it remind him of? Bernice had nodded off, lying back on the bed in a very unromantic slump, her legs dangling over the edge. The knock on the door made her sit bolt upright, suddenly in full-on Christmas morning mode. She made herself take a couple of deep breaths as she adjusted her robe and curled her legs up beneath her. She licked her lips quickly and pushed her hair back into place. Then she called out, "Come in!" The door swung open, and into her room stepped the two men in dark glasses from the Garland College bar. They were still wearing their hats. "We," one of them began, stepping forward and pointing at her. "Who?" Bernice bellowed, jumping to her feet. "How?" But then a number of things happened all at once. Stokes had been concentrating on a particular place on the horizon, the vague area where he was sure that the star that was the Winton was going to appear. The whine from the canyon had levelled off to a steady pitch, and maintained that volume, an irritating noise that seemed about to continue indefinitely. Stokes couldn't paint while that was going on, so he'd spent his time observing the strange shape in the chasm, putting his fingers in his ears, and wondering if he should tell somebody about all this. The dear ladies and the others at the camp must surely have heard this ear-splitting howl. The spaceship appeared on the horizon, and Stokes blinked at the shimmering shape for a moment. It looked bigger. Or was that just the effect of the atmosphere? He moved to the edge of the parapet and looked down into the valley. The moving thing had started to move again. Very fast. And was that just the billowing of the mist, or was it emitting smoke? Stokes tried to think quickly, but the noise had reached a crescendo. All thought of his painting abandoned, he sketched quickly on his easel, trying to record the shape of the thing in the valley. It was long and thin, pointing upwards with a rounded top. Right, it was emitting smoke, probably from its rear end. Right, it was making a screeching whine. Actually, that had changed. It had now become a low rumble. And now a whooshing. Stokes looked back into the valley and cried out as one end of the object down there flared with brilliant light. The object vibrated for a moment, and then, with a sudden roar, leapt up from the floor of the valley, illuminating every wall with the fire from its tail. Stokes staggered back from the cliff edge, his easel blown aside, as the thing that... Missile! Flashed past him on its way skyward. His ears ringing, peering through the vapour trail that had filled the valley and was billowing out across the sand. Stokes managed to see where it was heading. It had the tiny star of the ship locked in its sights, and was heading straight for it. From the informative record of recent Grell history. The Grell ship hit the Winton like a predator striking its prey. Its spine slammed into the vessel's data ports, invading them with the usual viruses, which disabled all the cruiser's security systems and blew open every airlock. Tentacles from the Grell ship whipped around the other ship's body, and Grell airlock tubes thrust themselves into each open lock. The Winton, every motion system in disarray, spun on its axis, one thruster firing randomly. This spun the Grell ship underneath the other vessel, putting it for a moment between the Winton and the planet below. Which was why, as shrieking Grell servitors, eager for battle, ran into the other ship, spiralling their axes, the bridge crew, including the Grell master, were suddenly aware of an imminent danger, one that they had utterly failed to predict. Extract ends. Bernice staggered across her cabin as the ship rolled. She grabbed one of the men by the lapels. "In the name of Goddess, did you get here? Are on a mission from—" "On Perfecton." Professor Warrender woke up screaming. "Oh no," he squealed. "It's all coming true." From the informative record of recent Grell history. The Grell master hit a button. Explosive bolts fired. The command pod flew clear. Extract ends. Doran stepped out of the bathroom. A screeching, squid-faced humanoid with an axe was running down the corridor towards him. He put up his hands. The blade slashed down. Bernice swung her head at a sudden light outside the porthole. She saw something rushing at the ship. "God," said the man. The missile hit the Winton, and it turned it into a vast, expanding blossom of flame.